From the peak of Saddle Butte to the depths of the LaPorte Slough, this is the Trent Klarenbach Podcast, brought to you by the Klarenbach Grain Report and the Klarenbach Special Crops Report. I'm very excited about today's guest. He's been in the industry for many, many years. He's an OG, or original gangster, if you're not familiar with that term. I've been following his work for at least 30 years. His name is John De Pape. He's been a grain merchant for Cargill. He's a local floor trader on the Winnipeg Commodity Exchange. He's been a director of marketing at ICE. He's led the market closure and investigation into a major squeeze. He designed the new canola contract. He opened a Canadian office for Sparks Companies, which was an international ag consulting firm, a legendary international ag consulting firm, I might add. He's been an independent trader and risk advisor since 2004. He played a role in informing the market about the Canadian Wheat Board. I remember reading the Canadian Wheat Board Monitor back in the day. A subject matter expert in every grain industry merger reviewed by the Competition Bureau, either on behalf of the Competition Bureau or the parties. He's been a subject matter expert in a number of commercial disputes. For example, Dreyfus sued CN for lack of service in 2014. He was hired by LDC to estimate the losses. John currently has an advanced grain pricing program, which is a great resource for farmers. He also created the Trading Floor, a website, which I'm lucky to be a contributor to. And the common thread throughout what John does is he wants to provide market efficiency and fairness. He wants to educate, train, and inform farmers on how the market works, specifically how grain traders approach the market. And he really wants to play a role in improving the market. I just love what John's doing, and I think it's a great initiative to help farmers understand how the market works and how traders behave. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you, Trent. After that, I don't know, is there anything to talk about now?
Well, it's you've got quite a history here, and you've been on my radar for many, many years, and yeah, it's great to have you on here. Let's just start to what you're doing right now. I think it's really cool. You have the Trading Floor and your advanced grain program. Do you want to just talk a little bit more about that? And then we'll talk about that, and then we'll maybe go back and talk about your history and share some of your experiences.
Yeah, sure. I'll start with the advanced grain pricing program. I started it, I guess, maybe about 8 or 9 years ago. And I was looking at the way farmers approach hedging and grain marketing. And I saw a gap. And we've talked about this, that, I go back to my days at the Commodity Exchange, and we would train farmers on futures and options and basis. I even taught the same courses at the Canadian International Grain Institute. And I look back at that and I thought, we just aren't teaching it properly. We're not giving farmers enough. And so I thought, well, I can play a role there. I started looking at the market, how a hedger would look at it, hedging in futures, and then taking advantage of carrying charges or inverses. And we never taught farmers any of that. So I wanted to do that on behalf of farmers, but I wanted them to understand what I was doing. So I would put on workshops. And I put on quite a few going back 8 or 9 years ago. And then I would say, this is how a grain trader looks at the market and how he looks at basis. We separate futures and basis in our decisions. In fact, when I was at Cargill, we have merchants that were basis traders, and we had other merchants that were flat price or futures traders. So even at Cargill, they separate the two. So why can't we do that at the farm? So I explained how you would do that. And it gets a little involved. And I would end my presentation by saying, here's the deal. I can do this for you. I could, have an arrangement with David Derwin, future broker with Momentum Financial, David is licensed to operate managed futures accounts. And so what we do is we say, okay, sign up a certain tonnage. We will actually execute the futures on your behalf and keep you well informed. I remember one farmer said, "Oh, you're not going to be phoning me all the time with ideas of what to do." And we said, "No, we do it for you." And he said, "Oh God, thank you." So we knew we had a market for this. And so what we do is we actually execute the hedges as we see under certain protocols, certain guidelines. If the market's trending higher, we're not selling. We wait for a signal to sell. And with my limited experience with technical signals, and we don't advise on basis. Sorry, we don't get involved in actual cash sales. We only advise on basis. So we watch the basis and spreads, which are really the same thing. And as long as the spreads are paying us to move our hedges, keep our hedge in place, we do that. We earn the carry. And then eventually we say, okay, now's the time to pull the trigger on basis. Go find your best cash price. And we are doing it on spring wheat and canola. Did some soybeans. The original version of this, I worked with RBC Capital Markets. We actually used swaps instead of futures. And it worked really well. We had a couple of years there where our net return on everything we did, including the basis, which the farmer actually did, our net results were at times better than the best street price all year. And so we thought, okay, this is a decent program. And part of that program was weekly providing market insights. And I would wait till Friday to get full week's data of prices and whatnot. And then I would work over the weekend and maybe Monday, writing up my thoughts on the market. And I realized that by that time I was writing about something that happened a week ago. And it's not timely anymore. I wanted a quicker way to toss the newspaper, so to speak. And that's where the idea of the trading floor came in. I thought if I could devise a system where if I see something, I get an idea, I can just sit and type it out, send it, and it's immediate. That would be much better. And my advanced grain pricing clients all agree. They love it. They, instead of waiting, they see exactly what I'm thinking at the time. And then I thought, well, why not make that available to other people as well, not just people within my program? And so the trading floor was born. We have clients that are members, I'd like to call them, that are not part of the advanced grain pricing program, as well as those that are. And it's an initiative to help raise the bar in terms of understanding how the market works. It's not a new service. One guy had signed up, called a month or two later, he said, I thought this was going to be a news service. I said, well, why would I get into the news business? You can get that anywhere. What I am providing is insights and potential strategies and ways to use the market. And that's my wheelhouse. That's stick to my knitting. I'm not going to try to be something that I'm not. I'm not going to try to compete with people who are much smarter than me on different topics. So.
Well, you introduced me to the trading floor, and I think it's a great resource. One of my missions is to help farmers become more educated about how the market works and how traders think, and the trading floor is a great resource for that. Pardon me?
Let me jump in. I was going to say, your background and my background and our approaches to the market are quite significantly different. You're technical and fundamental. And I just want to remind you about the times that both signals have said the same thing. In fact, just recently, we both looked at the canola where it's at now, thinking that you're saying technically there's support at 650, I think it was. And after the Chinese tariffs knocked the market down, we found significant support. Fundamentally, I thought. So it's kind of interesting how the two can marry up.
I think that's fascinating. And when you can, I don't focus on the fundamentals, but I know enough that when fundamentals and technicals are aligned, our conviction is stronger, and we're, for a good reason, I believe. So And yeah, it's interesting. And, and you talk about the basis at a level that I don't talk about, and open interest and carry. So if you haven't checked out John's trading floor, I encourage you to, because every time I get an email with John's report or his analysis there, it's a great learning experience for myself, and I become, I think it's a great resource.
Okay.
So you have a long, extensive history. Like, you started at Cargill back in the day, and then like Sparks was I don't know if they're still around anymore or not, but they were a real big deal back at one time. Then, like, that was quite a powerhouse.
Yeah, it was. It originally started as Sparks Commodities. The patriarch is Willard Sparks. And if you ever read Dan Morgan's book, Merchants of Grain, he's in there.
Yeah.
And I can't remember which firm he works for, but he's mentioned. Brilliant guy. And when he left that firm, what he wanted to do was trade, because that's his main thing, is trading. But he wanted good research. So he thought, I'll hire the best researchers I can find, and then we'll sell that research to support that. So he was part owner of Refco. And in their Memphis office, there was on one side of the floor was Sparks. The other side was a Refco trading office. And Willard's office was on the Refco side. Because before he was anything, he was a trader. But
Yeah.
they became, as you say, extremely well known. Basically, their client list was the who's who in the food business. And the one thing they didn't have was a real good farm level consulting firm. So we tried a few things there, but they've been bought by a company called Informa. And I think now Informa is morphed into something else. Everybody I worked with there is retired. So it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's gone.
Yeah.
Great
So what
experience.
year would that have been when you were at Sparks?
97. Yeah,
Okay.
97, the year my second daughter was born. And I was there for about 7 years.
Yeah, interesting. So you opened the Canadian office.
Yeah, they had offices, kind of a personal story. They had offices in different places around the world. They wanted to open an office in Poland. And they wanted me to go there to open the office. Our first daughter, 3 years earlier, was born 3 months prematurely. It was a high-risk pregnancy. And at that time, we were expecting our second, and the doctor considered it to be a high-risk pregnancy. So based on that, I said, I'm not going to Poland. Nothing against Poland or the medical technology. I just didn't want to be that far from home.
Yeah.
So I said, let's open a Canadian office instead.
Interesting. Wow. Is that before you were with the Winnipeg Commodity Exchange, or was that?
No, when I worked at the Commodity Exchange, we went through in '94. We went through a tumultuous period when the coal market got squeezed, and forcing us to reevaluate that. And then we thought we've got to reevaluate all the contracts. And at the time, we had, I think we still had an old contract. We had flags, feed weight. We had gone through iterations on barley, and we hired Sparks to review the barley industry in Canada with the wheat board or without the wheat board, and what it would mean to risk management. And because we were the commodity exchange, we wanted to know, if there was no wheat board, is there a growth potential for a barley futures contract? They outsourced that contract to Sparks. So I got to know the guys at Sparks quite well. And as they finished, they came and gave their final report. We went for drinks, and I announced to them that I was thinking about going on my own, and is there a chance that we could work together? And they said, better yet, why don't you just come and work for us? So that's how that happened.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So barley, it left. When did it cease being underneath the Canadian wheat board monopoly then. And there's basically the futures contract never got any kind of volume on it, did it? It was
I'd say Charlie Mayer got rid of oats in '89. Barley would be a few years after that, because he tried to remove barley the same way as oats through like an executive order. I think it was. It didn't go through a vote in Parliament. And Sask Wheat Pool challenged it. And so we had the Continental Market, called Continental Market, for something like 40 days and went back to the wheat board. But then, man, I can't remember. Yeah, good question. When barley was actually removed from the board. But, well, I think it stayed with the wheat board until the very end, 2012.
Yeah, when I was farming, I was growing some feed barley, hopes to generate some cash flow different times. And I remember looking at those different options with the futures, and there's times I wish I would have, used them. They're low volume, but it might have worked out for me on my operation at that time. It just highlighted to me the importance of how effective the futures contracts can be for hedging your prices and working on your farm risk management applications there.
Yeah.
So that squeeze in canola, what exactly? I was not familiar with that. What exactly did that look like?
Well, it looked like a squeeze. The market demoralization, market manipulation, we call them squeezes. Just about every contract goes through periods where things get a little tight, and we sometimes refer to it as a hug. Not quite a squeeze, but there's different players have different opinions. But a squeeze is when a trader controls the deliverable stocks and is demanding, is long futures, demanding the short deliver to them, and yet knowing the short can't because they don't have access to any of the deliverable stocks. And we saw it with the company called Ferruzzi and Chicago soybeans in, I'm going to say, late 80s. We saw it with the Hunt brothers in silver. So, you can go Google, squeeze, that kind of thing. We have had different market squeezes at Winnipeg before. There's one in barley, I remember. There's one in wheat. But this one really smelled differently. And they, as we got into it, we realized that the players really thought that they could, give that market one heck of a squeeze to their gain, everybody else's loss. And the exchange wouldn't do anything about it. And we surprised them, I think. We did. And so it was a June contract. First, the March 94 contract, there was evidence of a squeeze. There were shorts that were caught, and they knew that you could see what was going on. And it worked out. Sometimes these things work out. But the June didn't feel like it was going to work out. They were going to take a run at the June as well. If I remember it, there was roughly 50,000 tons deliverable. And they told us they wanted to take delivery of 150,000 tons. We said, you can't do that. And they said, well, let the contract default then, which you never, ever, ever allow. So we had to close it down. And so June 6th, we let the trade into June. It was clear nothing was going to happen. So on June 6th, the board gave me instructions to shut down the market. And why me? I was director of marketing. I was the only one at the exchange at the time that had cash trading background. And so I was more familiar with the whole delivery process, the connection between cash and futures that you really need to assess that kind of thing. And so we shut down the market and then opened an investigation to see what happened. And I guess it's safe to say now that it was XCAN that squeezed the market. And XCAN, okay, which was the trading arm of the three Prairie pools.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Eh?
So
what changes did you make to the, sorry?
I was just going to say, so the end result of that was we were going to charge them with market manipulation And they came back and they said, and I think that, I can't remember the dollar amount. It was in the millions that we were going to fine. And they came back and said, how about this? We'll pay you $250,000 as a fee, not fine, with no admission of guilt. Just, we'll pay you that $250,000 to cover any legal costs that the exchange might have gone through. And we'll just shake hands and call it a day. That's what the exchange did, which bothered me a little bit, but it was my decision. So then the exchange decided to change the contract. And one of the first things was to no longer have a June contract, because that just had bad connotation now. And so that's why the previous contract was Jan, March, June, September, November. So we now went to Jan, March, May, July. And so that was number one. That was a must. A want. That had to happen. Get rid of the June. And the other thing was, the other part of my instructions was to design it in a way that it would be unsqueezable. The previous contract was squeezable in a way because there was limited delivery space and ability. Only a few people could have access to that space. And so we really relied on a number of players to really play nice. And so what we came up with, maybe I'll explain, the old contract was Vancouver priced with delivery in the interior terminals. So Edmonton, Calgary, Lethbridge, Saskatoon, Moose Jaw, or what we called alternate delivery. That was back in the day of the Crow. So we had Vancouver price backed off by the Crow rate. It was simple to say, well, if it's worth this much in Vancouver, it's this much in Saskatoon. And most of the deliveries on that contract occurred in Saskatoon and then Moose Jaw. And so we thought, well, let's make delivery priced and delivery in central Saskatchewan. And my intent was to have every licensed primary elevator as a delivery point. So you have multiple players, multiple locations, and lots of space. And so it was, I don't want to pat myself on the back and say it's my design. It was, I came up with the details. It was accepted by a committee, and it's the exchange that really designed it. But I was tasked to come up with the details of it. So it was basically delivery anywhere in the prairies, as long as you met certain requirements. It's an elevator. You have to be able to receive by truck and ship by truck and rail. The ability to clean, all those things. And then there's also financial requirements. So just about every primary elevator in Western Canada is licensed as a delivery point, whether they're used or not.
Yeah. Do you have any idea what percentage of those contracts will be delivered against, or?
No, sometimes we get almost zero deliveries. And that's another topic for maybe another day. I think the culture around deliveries has totally changed. Whereas my days as a trader, you would always look at delivery as an option. And I traded feed grains in Thunder Bay, so we were always looking at, do we deliver or stand for delivery for feed wheat in Thunder Bay? That was just part of our merchandising toolkit. Well, now I've had merchants tell me that on canola, they don't look at delivery, even though they own and operate elevators that are delivery points. They say, well, future delivery, that's just not part of our mandate. And so the culture around that has changed. I've seen great opportunities to make delivery, and the companies just don't. It's not our deal. So that changes the complexion of the market a little bit.
They just buy back or reverse the position, and
I remember going into delivery, what we call first notice day, the first delivery day. You have a couple thousand contracts, and it's still open. You see some deliveries immediately, and then it would taper off. And
what contains a connection loss?
Sorry about that. And the
stage the connection real sharply.
Sorry, that's my trading
All right.
system. I should get rid of that.
Well, you might have a trade to make here. Might be a good opportunity in the next few minutes.
So as I say, yeah, sorry, I've lost track now. What was I saying?
Well, we're talking about delivery and
Guess we'll have to cut this out. I can't remember.
yeah. Well, I
Um,
mean, the lack of delivery, the culture's
Yeah.
changed around the delivery.
Yeah, usually there's some deliveries for a number of reasons. But I remember one delivery month not that long ago, the open interest went to zero even before the contract had expired. No interest in taking delivery, no interest in making delivery. I guess that's okay, but to me, it shows a different view of how futures are meant to work for you. You look at any U.S. market, Chicago, Kansas, whatever, you always see people getting involved in that interplay between cash and futures at expiry. But that's
Is that? They use the term the wheat board hangover for the lack of adoption of these tools in Canada. And I always thought, I remember back when the internet came out, I was looking to learn how to market grain on the internet, and I was finding these US forums, and they were using this language I studied in university but never had any application for it up here in Canada. Puts, calls, options, futures, right? And they just seem to be further ahead of us at that time, and I think that continues to be the case. Do you think that's still the case, or is it a gap now?
Yeah, there's no doubt. And I would call it a wheat board hangover among farmers and among the trade. I think the trade is quite risk averse. And I've seen examples of them not really using futures the way we would have before. Wheat, for instance, Minneapolis wheat is not the greatest hedge mechanism for Canada. And I think that over the years, when following 2012, I think the trade jumped in and they thought, okay, we can do this. We can, trade in Minneapolis. And it didn't take long for them to realize that it's not that good a hedge. So I think what they do now is, and it's just, meet my thinking. I have no evidence of this, but I think now if they sell a cargo of wheat, they go out with a special, hit some targets, and cover as much as they can, as opposed to buying futures. They try to do as much back to back as they can on wheat. Less so on canola. Canola, I think they still trade it conventionally. They sell canola. They buy futures. They buy canola. They sell futures. Typical hedging. But I think that partly because of the wheat board, but also because a large proportion of what we grow there has no futures contract. You look at all the array of pulses and other special crops. There's no futures. So they're used to managing their risk, particularly that way, and that could certainly bleed into crops like wheat when the futures doesn't really work for you anyway.
Well, and it's not. It still takes some skill, but it's maybe a little less complicated.
Which is
offsetting it with sales instead of using the futures market.
Sure, and I'm sure we're going to end up talking about target contracts, which is one of my favorite topics.
Which what?
Target contracts.
Target. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Target. The grain industry loves them. If you think about it, they sell a cargo of something. What's their risk? The risk is that the price will go up before they can cover it. Well, if there's no futures, then I recall when working as a trader, if we were trading in a commodity that had no futures, you are kind of limited to how much business you can put up, because there's only a certain amount of risk that the company would have an appetite for. So you put on a bit of business, then you have to go out and make sure you cover it. Go long to cash and then sell, but typically we'd like to sell first. But So, there's only so much risk. So with targets, grain companies have a whole book of targets. They know at what levels they need to pay to get a certain amount of grain above the current bid. And so they can go out and sell 50,000 tons of yellow peas and just turn around and hit a bunch of targets that appear to be above the market, but they're not really. That is the market. And so if they use targets or specials that facilitate this back-to-back kind of trading. My problem with it is nobody sees it. So, that you've got your target triggered, and I've heard guys say, "Oh, yeah, I got my target triggered, 50 cents above the market," and they think, "Oh, they must have been short." Not necessarily. The problem is that the posted price that they're saying isn't really the market, and so they use that to their advantage. So that to me is the way they're managing risk now, even in wheat. I doubt they're doing it so much in canola, maybe some, but canola we still have the futures to use.
So your favorite topic is price targets. Let's build on that a little bit more.
Well, price transparency.
Price transparency. Yeah. Okay.
Which I think is an odd term. It used in economics, price transparency, the ability to see prices. But if it's transparent, you can't see it. So I prefer price visibility. I want to know what prices are really being traded, and we really don't see it. We really don't see it because there's an incentive for the grain companies and buyers to keep their posted price below where the actual transactions are. Because if you're going to sell to them, they're happy to buy that. But they also, if there's all of a sudden a flood of selling, they're buying it below where they know they can sell it. But it's, I've watched things like, I get into spreads a lot. So right now with wheat, I can show you all the prices going out 12 months, delivery out 12 months, and it's pretty well flat. But the futures market has a carry. So, their premiums out there, but they're not showing that. And that to me is indicative that these prices aren't real prices. They're just prices that they feel they have to put out. And maybe that's being harsh, but the more I look at it, the more I get involved in what's being posted and what's actually being transacted, the more I see that the posted prices just aren't where the deals are happening. And just about every farmer I ever talked to about this, they agree. They say, "Oh yeah, I sell 90% on targets or specials."
Yeah.
So
I wonder how these prices are determined, these posted prices. I like using them to get indication of the trend, but like who's setting these prices? Is there a meeting every morning, or is there?
There used to be years ago.
Yeah,
long before my time. But no, I don't know. I know that if you ever talk to anybody in the trade, they will say that it's very competitive, and I believe it is.
Yeah.
Having worked there and worked with some of them on different things, it is competitive. They always want to know what the other companies are paying, but that also gives them an incentive to not really show their cards either. So there's another reason why they keep the price down. We'll let the other guy think that we're only paying $13, for canola, when really we'll pay up. That's the other thing about targets. When a bunch of targets get triggered, that business has been done. But not only do we not know as the farm community, as the market in general, but the competition doesn't know either. So I'll use real names. When Viterra goes out and triggers 20,000 tons of targets, the competition doesn't know. So they don't know what they're competing with. And so we really don't have as competitive a market as we like to think we do.
Is there any examples in the world where there's a recording mechanism where you can actually see price and volume sales, like what we would want to see for visibility? Does the United States have a system in place like that, or is it? And I go back to, you touched on a few things. I made a bit of a tangent here, but in Dan Morgan's book, Merchants of Grain, there's a comment in there, and it references the oil companies, how secretive they are, but the grain companies are very secretive.
Sure. Yeah.
And as I remember that quote in there, or that similar context, is there any examples where there's some sort of price discovery in the or visibility in the world?
Not to the extent that I think we're talking about. In the U.S., ever since 72, with the Great Grain Robbery, which is when Russia bought everything that was available before anybody realized they had bought everything, and disrupted the market that year and for years following. Coming out of that, the USDA now demands any exporter to report sales to the USDA, but just volume, not price, and not even necessarily to where. So often you'll see 100,000 tons sold, new crop, to undisclosed, but they're reporting the volumes, they're not the prices. But you can look around. There's different services in the U.S. that do provide prices, and whether they're basis prices or flat prices. And I suspect they have a lot more faith. The market down there has a lot more faith in those prices than I have in our prices.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And I think it could be, it's just a different culture. In my day, I go back to a left visit trader. If we were short and we needed more wheat, more barley, feed wheat, feed barley, or canola, or whatever it is, we would raise our price. We would, improve the basis. We never even dreamt of, having a special. But I think it comes out of a change in rail freight. We had single car rates only. But then when we went to unregulated freight, where the railroads could provide incentives to load large blocks of cars, which gave elevator companies an incentive to build facilities that could load blocks of cars for a cheaper freight rate. Now we're talking about a different animal. Now there are times when you may want to buy up a small amount just to finish a train. You don't want to raise your bid and then buy more than what you need. And so that was kind of the emergence of specials. And I'm not sure when Target contracts came up, but those, they came out afterwards. But the current culture around merchandising and buying, I think, is a function of the freight environment we have now.
Okay. All right. So target pricing seems like a real advantage for the buyer.
I agree.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is farmers love them too.
Yeah.
But I know grain companies love them. It gives them. I think this is where you're going. I agree that it gives them a clear advantage if they know where they can buy X thousands of tons. That gives them some comfort in making sales as well. That they wouldn't have without those targets. They would be selling more blindly, and in a way, it enables them to be more aggressive selling. All right.
And does it put is it actually a form of price control?
Well, control.
Well, I mean, you put a cap on it. You put a cap on the price. If everyone's picking 15, it's usually a round number, 10 or 15 or 12 or something, right?
What I've noticed is possibly more so in wheat that when we start to approach what we call magic numbers, the round numbers,
Yeah.
as we approach those magic numbers, they act like resistance. To use your market terms.
Yeah.
So what I've seen is if the futures is rallying, taking prices higher, as we approach those magic numbers, you'll see the basis. They'll lower their cash price. So you see the futures go up 15 cents a bushel, and the basis drop 7. And to me, that's an advantage in that, okay, if the market's going to take us through these targets, because the character of the target is, it's not just their choice, it's like a call option. If the market goes through that strike and the target, they have to buy that grain from you. You know what I mean? So they may not want to, at this point in time, necessarily trigger all those targets. So if the market's rallying, they will pull the basis back because, and it's logical, if they're going to have these targets triggered and end up buying a lot of grain, they want to make sure they buy it at a much beneficial basis for them. And this is another factor that's, the way grain traders look at market versus farmers. Grain traders, when there is a futures and a basis, they focus on that basis. Farmers focus on the flat price.
Yeah.
And many times I've heard farmers say, I don't know what the basis is. I don't care. As long as I get my $15, and I get that. But that, in a way, plays into the buyer's hands because basis is all that matters to him. Not long ago, this spring, I had a friend say that he was real happy he got a forward price for his canola delivered this fall at $15 a bushel. This is a pretty good deal for a new crop. I asked him what the basis was. He said, I don't know. So I did the math. It was 65 under, which is a horrendous basis. But the matter is, he got his $15. And so the advantage in that environment is the grain company owns canola at 6,500, which is great ownership as a basis trader. And yet was able to give the farmer $15. So they, I'm not going to say they're billing us or anything. I mean, I would do the exact same thing as them. They're using the market the way that it's structured for them to use, and they've got benefits of size and things like targets, and they're taking advantage of it.
Yeah, well, they make the tools. The tools are designed really. Well, you always design the tools for your own needs, and there's companies sitting across the table from a farmer, for example, and I mean those tools are there to facilitate purchases and profit margins. So yeah.
Well, let's go back to the basics with futures. It's price discovery and risk transference. It's both. And so that still applies, although there's some other things happening that allow the market to be, market power to be skewed, I think, in the favor of the buyer.
Yeah. So do you see any opportunities for that playing field to become more level? Like, what would it take for that to happen?
Well, I guess you can guess my view of target price contracts. I think, think about it. It's like if you sign a target price contract with a grain company, it is the same as selling a call option. They have the option. They're the buyer of the call option. They have the option to buy your grain at that price. If the market goes through that price, then it's not automatic. But they have the choice. So it is a call option on cash grain. But you're not getting a premium for it. You're selling that option, but you're not getting a premium.
Interesting.
And you're only selling it to one party. And I know many stories where guys have a target contract. Because that grain is committed to that company, they can't take advantage of a special that comes up with another company without canceling. And And so I think that if target contracts were made public in terms of not individual ones, but in terms of in aggregate volume and price levels, I think that would help the market. I maintain that if you used a platform like the new one that's, well, it's been around a while, My Grain Exchange, MGX, the guys out of Saskatoon, that if, I've talked to Merv Burshide there many years, we both agree on the idea of price transparency and the idea of put an offer on a platform like that, the same as a target. That's what a target is. It's an offer. But because it's structured with one company, it's an offer to that company. Well, make that offer to the market in general. That'd be number one. The other thing is, I just wrote a piece on it today. You can use call options on canola and wheat, and you could probably do it on oats, but canola and wheat, you could sell call options to have a futures target. And if that gets triggered, then you have targets on basis. You can actually build in my view, a better target using options, and what you might be able to do on basis, as opposed to locking in with one flag. Keep the cards to yourself rather than give up.
So that article's coming out today?
It's already posted on the floor, on the trading floor.
Okay, and today's August the 21st for reference point here. So yeah, I'll be looking at that for sure. Yeah, I almost need like a level 2 for that'd be nice to see if you could actually get that, right? See what all the offers and bids are at what level. But that'd take a coordination from non-interested parties to do that. So unlikely to happen. So.
Well, what I'm trying to do with the floor is I've also got an arrangement with the Combine app people. It used to be Farm Lead. They've morphed into, they've developed an app to keep track of your inventory and sales. And so now if you sign on to the trading floor, you get that app. But it's an app that, number one, if you have this app, Combine can give you an email address that you provide to the buyer, so that when they send your contract to you by email, send it to this email as well, and it will automatically populate your app. And the other feature is they call it Copilot, which is the version that I'm offering on the trading floor. That those sales then also get shared with me at the trading floor. And my intent is to eventually build up a database so we have actual prices. We'll never publish anybody's individual price. We want to aggregate in such a way that that's hidden, but we have a better view of the market, including target contracts.
That'd be a tremendous resource. I know even for my work I do, if I knew price and volumes, I can do so much more with my work than I can right now.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like I say, if we knew generally where the targets are, we would know where the resistance is.
Yes.
In terms of price, we'd know where the selling would come into, because if you go through a target price, that will generate the selling in the futures as a hedge. We know that. And so
sorry, I interrupted you again there.
No, I'm just held it.
Well, when I talk to farmers and they tell me what their target price is, like they're all typically the same values.
Sure. Like I said, the magic numbers, $14, $14.50, $7, $8, yeah.
And it's always the same numbers, and I challenge them why that number, and it's interesting, and it's not the questions isn't so much a challenge, but it's a question as to start the question. I'm asking the question, why $15? And it's not, the question isn't to get the answer, but it's just to stimulate some idea under why. Just because it's a round number, I love that number. It's my favorite number, whatever that number is. It's higher than today's value, right? There's all sorts of reasons, but
Yeah.
And that's why I like looking at the market. You can see, that information. You can find those resistance levels or anticipate where selling is going to occur, but it's hard to do in the cash market. It's easier to do in the public markets, but
Yeah. You'd think that we would gravitate toward knowing that, okay, $15 is a magic number. I'll go in at $14.80. Or, you think, and you would think that you would develop an array. And I think we see some of that. But, if it's going to trade at 15, I want a piece of that. Why would I sell it earlier? Well, you have to sell it at a lower price. You increase your chance of getting filled.
Yeah. I talk about that all the time. I'm glad you brought that up, because I wish I had the gains I've given up waiting for that extra cent or extra dollar or whatever that number is. So, like, what's the difference? Is it gonna, if you don't fill at 15 and you miss that opportunity, then you have anchoring bias and price goes down. But what if you filled at 14.90 or 14.80 in your example? Is that 20 cents going to make that much difference on your operation? Maybe. But what if you sell at 14?
Yes.
And you miss it all.
And I'm sure we both know people who have stood up their ground at a price and refused to move and missed out completely.
Yeah.
Because
so what's going to have a bigger? Yeah, what's going to have a bigger impact on that extra 20 cents or the dollar you lost or 50 cents you lost? It's always the loss that has a bigger impact.
Yeah. Well, and think of this. Using canola targets at $15. And let's say they get grain company or companies reach up to $15 and trigger those targets. They're not all going to be triggered.
Right.
So that's another question. How do the grain companies decide who triggers? When the price goes through when their street price goes through that target, they have to take it all. But if they choose to reach up and trigger some of them, how do they choose which ones? And so, if you're part of the pack at $15, there's a chance that, they're paying $15, but you just didn't get the tab. So
I'm guessing if that occurs, it's much the same manner as malt barley was selected and approved back when I was farming in the 90s and early 2000s.
Okay.
It wasn't always, where I'm going with this, it wasn't always based on the sample. A lot of determined history and relationships and names, and
it was
like that.
It was definitely on relationships.
Yeah. And that just opens up. So the term I like to use is front run the resistance level.
Yeah.
Because
I was going to say, as a futures trader, if we saw a lot of selling at on the trading floor in particular, you had the floor advantage. You knew there's another broker there who said, this price I'm just selling. Well, you'd sell a dime or 20 cents below that, knowing that if it did get the market did turn and go against you, you had this guy behind you that you could just quickly cover your short. So that's like front running, except sometimes front running when you have the order to sell and applied and you sell for your own account in front of it, that's not legal. But but if it's just in the market, it absolutely is.
Yeah. What was that like on the floor?
It's an interesting culture. When I went on the floor, I left Cargill to go on the trading floor. I decided I wanted to do that for 5 years and then go on to something else. I've actually written it down. That in 5 years I want to do something else related. But I just thought it would be a good experience, something I always wanted to do. And when I left the trading floor, I was cleaning out my desk. I left the floor to go and work for the exchange as director of marketing. They hired me. And I cleaned out my desk at home and I found this note that I'd written. So I missed it by about 4 months.
Oh, wow.
So just over 5 years on the trading floor. And so, the lesson for me was write things down.
Yeah, write your goal down.
I mean, if you failed to, how did that go? You failed to plan, you plan to fail. So yeah, you got to have a plan. It was different. And there were times, I'll give you an example of the kind of culture down there. I traded mainly canola, but we had feed grains as well. Feed wheat, feed barley, feed oats. And from my days at Cargill, I knew that feed wheat often inverted just because of the supply going into Thunder Bay. And we sometimes just got tight. Was it a squeeze? Not really. It was a real tightness in the delivery. And we knew this would happen over and over again. And so I wanted to buy a certain spread, which I thought would invert. And so I did. I went over to the feed wheat pit and bought this spread in fairly large quantities, and then left. And it was in the summer, and I tended to spend more time at home in the summer. I'd go into the training floor for a bit and then go home, or I wouldn't go on the floor at all. But I knew that if I went into that pit later on to try to sell that spread, that the other locals would the term we used they'd run me in. They would make it really hard to sell at a decent price. And if they could do that because it wasn't that terribly liquid. So what I did was I called a friend of mine who was a really good futures broker in the wheat pit. I asked him to sell it for me. And it took him a number of days. He just picked away at it. I come back to the floor a couple weeks later, and I had another guy come up. He said, "Hey, it's too bad you weren't here. I know you bought that March-May spread, and Donnie over here was selling it like crazy the last couple of weeks. You could have sold it too." I said, "Oh, gee, that's too bad." He didn't realize it was me he was selling it for, but you almost had to do that because the night would have. Yeah.
I've heard those stories, and maybe they talk about it a bit in that documentary called Floored. Did you ever see that?
No.
I think it's about Chicago, and it's a documentary on YouTube. Floored, and the Nigerian, one or both Nigerian brothers are in it, and a bunch of other characters. It must have been just a really wild place to be. From what I understand, anyways.
Chicago I was on that floor one time, and it's a totally different animal than what we had in Winnipeg. We were small beer, but there were times when we were pretty raucous, though. But we'd have a lot of activity right at the opening, and it would die down. And there are times that we'd have minimal volume until 15 minutes before the close, and then we'd have a lot of volume at the close.
So you're just hanging out there, visiting type thing?
Yeah.
And there's a pit for every crop, right? Every commodity?
In Winnipeg, we had two pits. One was canola, flax, and maybe traded rye, but canola and flax anyway. And the other pit was the feed grains. So it's feed wheat, feed barley, feed oats. And rye, I'm not sure where rye traded, but when I was there, we had the six commodities.
So I was out there visiting. I actually went out and visited with John Duvenel. I met with him there for a visit. Yeah. And so he had his office still. It was downtown, and maybe it still is today. I'm not sure, but that was the center of the grain business in North America at one time, Winnipeg. So
we were called Chicago of the North at one time.
Yeah.
Before the wheat board. Yeah.
And
we had a bigger wheat market than Chicago.
Yeah, just crazy. And so I don't know if I'm if it would existed or if I'm looking for it, but it just felt like there was still some energy there from that time. And maybe I was looking for it because this is stuff I'm interested in, but there's some taller buildings and you get the sense that it was a really, like it was a really cool place at one time. Well, the wheat board was down there and it was, it must have been, I don't know. Maybe if you grew up in it, you didn't recognize it, but I just felt there was still something there that.
Well, I don't know how long ago that was, but if you think back in history, when the exchange was there, the grain exchange building, then along came the wheat board. You had every grain company. And if you go back, back to the 30s and 40s, there was a lot more than 6 or 7 grain companies. There was like, I don't know, 20 or 30, maybe more what's called line companies. And then you had the Grain Commission and you had the railroads. And they were all there within a few blocks of Portage and Main. And so you had this a hub of that industry right in one place, partly because back in the day with the Winnipeg Grain Exchange, or Commodity Exchange, well, when you're a clearing member of the exchange, you're a member of the clearinghouse. Unlike retail, if you lose money trading, you have to pay it that day by, before it closes business. And if it's large enough, it has to be a certified check. And if you made money that day in futures, you'd get a check. And it was all paper. And so each company would have a runner. And when I was at Cargill, we had a runner that would pick up documents and deliver documents. And so there was a requirement within the grain exchange. If you're going to be a member of the grain exchange, and certainly a clearing member, you had to have an office within 2 or 3 blocks of Portage and Main.
Okay.
To facilitate physical delivery of documentation. And it wasn't just futures, payments, to the clearinghouse. It was, contracts, checks to other companies, all that. And so there was, I believe there's a real hubbub of activity, all grain related. And also on top of that, you had what we call bucket shops, where you could go and trade, the public could go and trade. And, you see this in some movies sometimes. It'd be like a shop and there'd be somebody with a chalkboard. And there apparently, before my time, quite a few of them within that same area as well. And so I think it would have been a fabulous time to be part of that industry.
Is there, like, it would have been a melting pot for characters, right? You mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
Is there any, are you aware of any documentation, any novels or any books about some of these players outside of maybe the large family's history? But has anyone ever wrote, there's been some Fleet Street stuff about Vancouver and different things. And is there anything like that in Winnipeg that you're aware of, or?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, what was the guy's name that wrote a book called The Exchange? I think I have a copy of him. I'm trying to think of his name. It didn't really get into the characters, but I like where you're going with that, because I think there really were colorful characters. Oh, yeah. And when I was on the floor, there's still a few, but and I would hear stories about years before with different characters. So it's worthy of a book, I think. For grain nerds like you and me, anyway.
Yeah. Hopefully someone. I guess there's less and less people around that remember that stuff. So my buddy worked for the wheat board out there, and he told me I think his case for the wheat board was all the mansions was it Wellington? Is that where?
Crescent, yeah.
Wellington Crescent, that's where the grain companies tended to, back in the day, in the 20s and the 30s, I guess.
Yeah. There's one stretch along Wellington Crescent. It's now called Munson Park. And it goes along the crescent of, I don't know how many, probably not a couple of blocks, but a couple of streets. And that was the Richardson estate.
Okay.
And so I think James Richardson did. I remember as a kid, there's this big, huge house my dad works for Richardson's. He ran their the farm, um, so I was a little more familiar with it. But across the street on the other side, so that was on the river side of Wellington Crescent. That was a river lot. On the other side of the street was another big mansion where George Richardson lived, and after him, Hartley, his son. So the Richardsons had this like 2 city blocks of
Wow.
high-priced real estate. And when Richardson's moved out of the river lot, which was, I can't remember how big it is, they donated it to the city on the condition that it never be developed. It stays as a park.
Oh,
And
wow.
it's a beautiful, and it's called Munson Park because they had bought the property from. Yeah, so just a little color there. But
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, and there's a few others that, along the Wellington Crescent, or in an area called Crescent Wood, which is Wellington Crescent goes through that, but there's other big houses in there.
Yeah, because like you say, there was a lot of grain companies back in the day, and just in a little bit of research I've did, there's I guess the wheat pool, maybe I don't know if UGG was aggressive buying them up or not, but Richardson probably was Pioneer. I just can't think of all the names of them offhand, but there was
Like the smaller line companies, you mean?
yeah,
Yeah.
smaller elevator companies, grain companies.
Yeah, where I was reading something. Oh, yeah, a friend of mine gave me a book that basically gave the history of the Canadian grain industry, but it was just names and, well, this company bought that, and it was kind of an interesting book, but very dry. There's no real characters in it. It was just which companies built elevators. The Inter-Ocean Grain Company or the Lake of the Woods Milling Company,
Yeah,
and all these different companies that had elevators, and they slowly got absorbed into the bigger ones. Yeah,
yeah.
like National.
Federal
Yeah,
stands out as one of the names, but would have been one of the larger ones probably.
yeah, yeah, and then National Grain as well.
Yeah, interesting.
I
Yeah,
think Cargill bought National Grain in the early 70s. I think.
I wonder what would Winnipeg be like if we didn't have the wheat board.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, they before the wheat board, we were called Chicago of the North because we had this huge wheat trading market.
Yeah,
Wheat board came in initially as a voluntary organization, didn't really have an impact, but that was in the 30s, 40, was it 43 that they got their single desk mandate and basically shut down the market. And I was told that at the time that happened, we lost 500 or 600 jobs in downtown Winnipeg.
is that right?
But then, ironically, when the wheat board, that's because the wheat board came in. When the wheat board was dismantled in 2012, they argued that the loss of the wheat board would mean loss of jobs downtown, about 500 or 600 people.
Is that right? Eh?
The only organization I know that when it was established, it lost jobs, and when it was closed down, it lost jobs. But
Well,
I think a lot of it was the retail brokerage business. If you have no futures to trade retail, then all these brokers lost their jobs. So, but yeah, I often wonder what Winnipeg would be like if we'd never had a wheat board. I think it would be more entrepreneurial than it is, because
yeah,
I know of people, stories of people that when the wheat board came in, they left. Went to Vancouver or wherever, and other markets, because in my view, this is my view, that an institution like the wheat board would throw a wet blanket on the industry, take away all kinds of incentives to be entrepreneurial and grow.
yeah.
And that's really what it did.
Well, it sure pushed farmers off the farm. I've said that it's been more responsible for more farmers leaving the farm than drought and grasshoppers combined.
I think you're right. But also give it credit for diversifying Western agriculture.
Oh
If it
yeah.
wasn't for wheat board, we wouldn't have canola, we wouldn't have peas, we wouldn't have lentils in the way we do now.
No, so that's where like my influences come from with Raymond Somerville back opening up that interprovincial border in the early 70s when he went to the Supreme Court, opened up the trade over cross border lines without going through the wheat board, and then Reinhold Nunweller, brought in canary seed and really grew all-state grain, and that was
Right.
just a desperate look for something that would produce some cash flow on your farming operation. In my mind,
Yeah.
that's what that was.
Yeah.
So I tend to focus on the negative about the Canadian wheat board, but
Well, as I do too, but if you don't remember history, you're bound to repeat it. So I think it's important to keep it in the forefront. I teach a course at or have last 2 falls at the University of Manitoba, financial risk management to the diploma program in the actually agriculture. And this last year, I brought up the wheat board. And when I think it was my first lecture, I was talking about background, and when I talked about the wheat board, and he said, "You're all familiar with the wheat board," and not one student knew what I was talking about.
yeah, I believe it.
It's not like, "Oh yeah, I've heard about it, don't know anything about it." It was, "Don't know what you're talking about." And these are 90% of them were kids from the farm.
Yeah, well,
I was astounded.
I have conversations with surprisingly a large number of people who they've heard about the wheat board. Their fathers had told them how difficult it was, but some of them don't really know anything about, and they got no reason to because they started farming after.
Sure.
But it's like it was a tough situation to farm under, that's for sure. But
Well, yeah, it's an interesting culture. Yeah, and I come from a farm family. My dad ran Richardson Farm, but he grew up on a farm, Swan Lake, Manitoba. My mom grew up on a farm in Prairie, Manitoba. And so, I've got access to that. And for the most part, both families were very much supportive of the wheat farm. So I'm kind of the outlier. But, my grandfather, he was deeply involved with the Manitoba Pool organization. This whole idea of working together. And don't get me wrong, I think it's a great idea to cooperate. I belong to a co-op in Winnipeg area. That's where I bought my gas. But I would get into arguments with wheat board supporters, and they would say it's cooperative. It's not cooperative, it's coercive. You have to. You don't have a choice. You have to deal with them. There's a difference. You're not cooperating anymore. And but also what struck me was one time talking to a farmer in Alberta, talking about the wheat board, and his view was he didn't. I think I brought it up, but the fact that the wheat board isn't getting you the best prices, and he said, "I don't care. I don't care if we don't get the top prices, as long as we're all getting the same price."
I know
that was what was important to him. And with that definition of socialism, equally sharing poverty or something. The equal sharing of poverty. That was wheat board.
Yeah.
And I know I got painted with this brush and anti-wheat board, and you mentioned the wheat board monitor that I wrote. In those days, I had wheat board supporters say, "Oh, it's this guy. He's a broker. He just wants to go to the wheat board to develop his own business." And I had been exposed enough to the wheat board to know that it was not working. And I said to many people, if it could work, I'd be all for it. If it actually provided the benefit that they say, I would be all for it. Because but it would have to be efficient. Because I want markets to work for everybody, and that means efficiency. And the one thing that wheat board wasn't was efficient, not at all. I was just going to say a short anecdote. Anytime you say that you provide, see if I got the numbers right, they would say that they provide a $4 a ton premium over the average price. That was their benefit, $4. But and that was in the annual report. You go somewhere else in the annual report, and their cost was $8 a ton. So what's costing farmers $8 a ton to have this organization earn them $4 over the average.
Yeah.
It doesn't.
I long suspected that it was a political tool in a lot of examples. To, obviously, I think and this goes back to World War II, which I think was probably maybe necessary to win the war and feed the Allies, but that those prices stayed in effect for years after the war ended, right? Whatever the price was, $2 a bushel, or so, I forget what it was, but I often wondered if it was a good tool to use to develop relations between Canada and other foreign countries, maybe by democracy, by favor. That was my suspect.
Yeah, I know that there's a time when there are large government buying agencies, and to some it made sense to have a large selling entity. So it was government to government and that kind of thing. So you have COPCO in China and Russia when they were buying, that was a government agency. And so these big sales were government to government. And there was, I think, an idea that, well, we can't leave that up to the private trade. Government has to be involved. And one of the benefits to trade that had nothing to do with the single desk, but the wheat board, was the financing guarantees. They would sell on credit.
Oh, yeah.
And basically the government of Canada would carry the risk of that credit. It was basically sovereign debt. And so, the wheat board sold into markets risk-free to the farm because of this carrying this financing arrangement. You didn't need the single desk for that. You could provide financing, government financing. Isn't that what EDC does? You could have done it without, but it was often touted that that's one of the benefits of the wheat board. That's all.
Yeah, and I think I was reading some of Jonathan Kingsman's books, Commodity Conversations. You might enjoy those books. I'll send you the link to them. But
sure, yeah,
they, like the Glencores and the large companies, are providing that to other countries, right? So they're figuring out a way to make it work. And they get pretty creative. I think they get very creative at times, but it's working.
Yeah, no,
Interesting.
exactly. Yeah.
Well, I've really appreciated this conversation. I think there's a lot more to unwrap here at a later date. And
yeah, I was thinking of other topics I'd love to talk about, but maybe for another time.
Yeah, well, you know what? Let's make it happen. Let's have another time for sure.
Sure.
And it seems to be an hour long is kind of what people's attention spans last for. But so your trading floor, I'll provide some links to that. A link in the description. People can find you on there. How else can people find you, John?
Oh, well, I'm on LinkedIn for whatever that's worth, but
Okay.
How else? As I mentioned to you before we got going, I'm not really into social media, so I do have an X account, but I don't really do anything with that. But so I think there are people like yourself, word of mouth. That's the best way. But I'll give you a good link. And one thing I should make clear, the trading floor has an initiative to help farmers understand the market.
Yeah.
But I've got to keep the lights on. It's not free, So what I'm charging is $6.25 a year, which gets everything on the trading floor. Plus it gives you that combine co-pilot app that you can use or not, but that's part of the deal. So
Yeah.
What I'd like it to be is, provide you with some insights, some strategies, some ideas on how the market's working and why grain traders may be doing certain things, and hopefully get feedback in terms of price data that we can then make public. To comment on price, just a price. I know there's some organizations out there that probably collect a lot of prices, but they keep it to themselves for their own use. And maybe it's from my days at the commodity exchange. I think cash price information is a public good. I think the market needs it to operate more efficiently. So my idea is to get as much good, robust, sound price data and make it available to in some form to everybody.
Well, I think the trading floor is a great resource, and I think that there's tremendous value at that price point, even just for the education aspect of it. And I think there's much more than that on there with your ideas and your strategies. So yeah, I'll make sure I put a link in the description, and yeah, hopefully people come and check you out.
Well, I appreciate the time.
Okay. Well, this has been fun.
Yeah, we should do it more often.
Well, we will do it more often. Thanks.
Yeah.